The distant colony planet Vorin 9 lay in ruins. The once thriving settlement was now a broken, silent graveyard. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke, and the sky was a dark, churning mass of ash and fire. The ground was a twisted sea of shattered metal and collapsed buildings. It was a place of death and danger. Ethan Carter moved carefully through the wreckage. His steps were slow and measured, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. Years of battle had made him cautious. A former soldier turned scavenger, Ethan had seen more than his share of war, and Vorin 9 was just another scar on the galaxy's face. His AI drone, Kara, hovered silently at his side, her sensors sweeping for movement. Still no signs of life. Kara's voice chimed in his earpiece, soft and mechanical. Ethan didn't respond. He didn't expect to find survivors, not after the Krell Dominion's orbital bombardment. The Krell were ruthless, their attacks designed to wipe out everything and everyone. Still, Ethan kept looking. He needed supplies, and if there were survivors, well, he couldn't just leave them behind. He moved deeper into the ruins, his boots crunching over broken glass and scorched stone. As he approached the remains of an underground bunker, a faint sound caught his attention. He froze. There it was again, a soft, trembling whisper. "Kara, scan," he murmured. "Life signs detected. 2. Weak. Non-human." Ethan's pulse quickened. Carefully, he approached the bunker's entrance and pried open the twisted metal hatch. The darkness inside was absolute, but his helmet's night vision cut through it. He climbed down the broken ladder and moved slowly through the cramped corridor. The whispers grew louder. Then he saw them. 2 small figures huddled in a corner, their bodies thin and trembling. They were covered in dirt and blood, their ragged clothing barely holding together. Their large, luminous eyes locked onto him, wide with terror. They were children, alien children. "Please," one of them whimpered in broken galactic common. "Please, no hurt." Ethan lowered his weapon slowly. "I won't hurt you," he said softly, his voice calm despite the situation. "I'm here to help." The twins didn't move at first. They looked at him with a mix of fear and desperation. The girl, or at least Ethan thought she was a girl, clutched her sibling tightly. The boy looked even worse, his skin pale and his breathing shallow. Ethan's heart twisted. He knew better than to trust aliens blindly. The Krell had taught him that lesson well. But these two were helpless. They weren't soldiers or enemies. They were just scared kids. "Come on," he said gently, pulling a survival blanket from his pack. "Let's get you out of here." The twins hesitated, then slowly crawled toward him. He wrapped them in the blanket and carried them back up the ladder, his senses on high alert. The planet was still dangerous. Back at his hidden outpost, Ethan laid the twins on a makeshift bed and let Kara begin medical scans. The AI's lights flickered, and her voice held a hint of confusion. "I can't identify their species," she reported. "Their energy readings are unusual. Unlike anything in my database." Ethan frowned. He glanced at the twins. Even now, their wide eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Something was definitely off. But they were just kids, and for now, they needed him. In the days that followed, the twins began to recover. Their names were Lyria and Sora. They spoke in broken, halting galactic common, often finishing each other's sentences in an eerie, seamless way. Despite their fragile appearance, they healed quickly, too quickly. Cuts that should have taken days to mend vanished overnight. Their energy returned far faster than it should have. Ethan noticed other things too. They rarely ate, yet they seemed stronger every day. Sometimes they would glance at each other and exchange entire conversations without a word. And at night, when they thought he wasn't watching, their eyes glowed softly in the dark. Kara remained suspicious. "Their readings still don't match any known species," she said one evening. "Ethan, this is dangerous. We don't know what they are." "They're kids," Ethan shot back. "Scared kids. Kids with powers we don't understand. Before Ethan could reply, the outpost's perimeter alarm blared. Kara's voice turned sharp. Incoming hostiles. Krell hunters. Ethan's blood ran cold. The Krell were here, and they wouldn't stop until they'd found whatever they were hunting. "Stay here," he told the twins, his voice firm. "Don't move." He armed himself and stepped outside into the night. The Krell came fast and silent, their cloaking devices making them nearly invisible. But Ethan was ready. He fought with brutal efficiency, his years of training taking over. Explosions lit the darkness, and the air filled with the sharp crack of gunfire. But there were too many. A hunter broke through his defenses, its blade flashing toward him. And then it stopped. Ethan stared in shock as the Krell's body lifted off the ground, held by an invisible force. The alien thrashed, but it was no use. With a flick of an unseen hand, it was thrown against a wall with a sickening crunch. Ethan turned slowly. Lyria and Sora stood at the entrance of the outpost, their small bodies glowing with raw energy. Their eyes burned with an otherworldly light. The air around them shimmered with power. The Krell never stood a chance. When the battle ended, Ethan faced the twins, his heart pounding. "What are you?" he whispered. Lyria's voice was soft. "We didn't mean to lie. We just didn't know if you'd still help us." They told him everything. They were the last surviving heirs of the Zervian Empire, a race long believed extinct. Their people had been feared for their devastating psychic abilities. The Galactic Council had tried to contain them. The Krell had tried to wipe them out. But there was one more thing. The Zervians had once been humanity's greatest enemy. A century ago, they had invaded Earth, killing billions. Ethan's own grandfather had fought in that war. Now the last of their kind were standing before him, begging for his protection. Before Ethan could decide what to do, Kara's sensors flared again. "Ethan, a Krell dreadship is approaching." The twins looked at him, their faces pale. "They found us." Ethan's mind raced. He had two choices: hand them over and save himself, or stand and fight. He never really considered the first option. As the Krell descended, Ethan fought harder than he ever had. He used every weapon, every trick, but the enemy kept coming. He was outnumbered and outgunned. Then the twins made their offer. "We can stop them," Sora whispered. "But if we do, you might not recognize us anymore." Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. The twins stepped forward, and the world erupted. Their power unleashed was a storm of light and fire. The Krell were torn apart without a single touch. The ground shook. The sky burned. When it was over, the twins collapsed. Ethan rushed to them, fear and guilt twisting in his chest. He had seen their power, and it terrified him. In the aftermath, as the twins recovered, Ethan made a promise. He would protect them, no matter what. But as he looked into their eyes, he saw something dark stirring beneath the surface, and he couldn't help but wonder, had he just saved humanity's greatest hope? Or its greatest threat? Ethan sat near the dim light of the outpost's old generator, his hands busy cleaning his rifle. The rhythmic sound of metal on metal echoed softly in the small room, providing a strange sort of calm. The twins, Lyria and Sora, lay on the bed across the room, their breathing steady and peaceful. At least, that's how they seemed. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the past few days, the twins had healed at an alarming rate. Wounds that should have taken weeks to mend had vanished overnight. Their strength returned so quickly it defied logic. And then there was the way they moved, the way they spoke, sometimes not speaking at all, yet understanding each other perfectly. Ethan had seen them exchange looks and somehow know exactly what the other was thinking. It was unsettling. Kara noticed it too. "Their recovery rate is abnormal," the AI whispered through his earpiece. "I still can't identify their species. Their energy readings remain inconsistent." Ethan sighed, his eyes flicking toward the twins. They were just kids, scared, orphaned kids, But there was something more, something they weren't telling him. That night, the outpost was silent, the air thick with the scent of scorched metal and distant fires. Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the destruction he'd seen on Vorin 9, the Krell's brutality, the endless fields of bodies. He wondered how the twins had survived. As he sat lost in thought, the perimeter alarm blared. The sudden sound shattered the stillness, and Ethan was on his feet in an instant. Krell hunters, Kara reported. 3 signatures. Cloaked. Ethan's blood ran cold. Krell hunters were elite, fast, silent, and deadly. They wouldn't stop until they found their prey. "Stay here," he told the twins, his voice low and firm. "Don't move." Their wide eyes filled with fear, but they nodded. Ethan grabbed his weapons and stepped outside into the night. The outpost's floodlights flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the wreckage. The wind carried the faint sound of footsteps, almost too soft to hear. Ethan's training kicked in. He moved like a ghost, his steps silent, his rifle raised. He scanned the area, his visor's thermal readings struggling against the Krell's advanced cloaking tech. They were out there, watching, waiting. The first attack came fast. A blade slashed through the air, narrowly missing Ethan's throat. He spun, firing a burst of plasma. The Krell shimmered into view, its reptilian face twisted in a snarl. The creature fell, but there were more. Ethan fought with brutal efficiency. He used the environment, setting traps and using the terrain to his advantage. But the Krell kept coming, their numbers pressing in. He took down the second one with a well-placed shot, but the third. The third Krell was fast, too fast. It slammed into him, sending them both crashing to the ground. Ethan's weapon skittered away. The alien's blade rose high, and Ethan knew he wouldn't be able to stop it in time. But the strike never came. The Krell froze, its body suddenly lifted into the air. It thrashed and hissed, but some unseen force held it tight. Ethan stared, his breath caught in his throat. Then the Krell was flung backward like a ragdoll, smashing into the wall with a sickening crunch. Ethan turned slowly. Lyria and Sora stood at the entrance of the outpost. Their small bodies glowed faintly, their eyes burning with an eerie, otherworldly light. The air around them shimmered, heavy with power. Without a word, the twins raised their hands. The remaining Krell were lifted off their feet, their weapons ripped from their grasp. They struggled, but it was useless. With a single, terrifying burst of energy, the Krell were slammed into the ground, their bodies broken and still. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stared at the twins, his mind struggling to process what he'd just seen. Lyria and Sora stood trembling, not from the attack, but from their own power. What was that? Ethan's voice was barely a whisper. Lyria looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "We didn't mean to. We had to help." Sora clung to his sister, his small body shaking. "We didn't want to hurt anyone," he said softly. Ethan's heart pounded. He wanted to believe them. But the display of power he'd just witnessed was beyond anything he'd ever seen. The Krell were some of the deadliest warriors in the galaxy, and the twins had destroyed them without even touching them. Kara's voice broke the silence. "Ethan, their energy levels have spiked. This isn't normal. This isn't safe." Ethan ignored her. He knelt in front of the twins, his voice calm despite the storm raging inside him. "What are you?" he asked gently. The twins exchanged a look. One of those silent conversations Ethan had seen too often. "We can't tell you," Lyria whispered. "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because you wouldn't want us here anymore." The words hit Ethan harder than he expected. Despite everything, he didn't want to see fear in their eyes, fear of him. But the fear wasn't just theirs. A part of him was afraid too, afraid of what they were, afraid of what they could become. He took a deep breath. "You saved my life," he said finally. "That's enough for now." The twins' relief was palpable, but as Ethan led them back inside, his mind raced with questions. Who were they really? And what kind of danger had he just brought into his home? As the night wore on, Ethan kept his rifle close, and in the darkness, the twins' eyes glowed softly, a reminder that some questions might have answers he wasn't ready to face. The room felt heavier than before, as if the very air carried the weight of the questions Ethan had been holding back. The Krell's bodies lay outside, broken and still, but the real danger might already be inside his walls. He sat across from the twins, his sharp eyes never leaving them. The dim light cast long shadows on their faces, making their strange, luminous eyes seem even more unnatural. "Start talking," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "What the hell was that out there?" For a long moment, neither of them answered. Lyria stared down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. Sora shifted closer to his sister, his fear obvious, but there was something else there too. Guilt. "We didn't mean to lie," Lyria finally whispered. "We just didn't know if you'd still help us." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Help you? After what I just saw, I don't even know what you are." Sora flinched, but Lyria slowly lifted her head. There was something heartbreaking in her expression. Fear, sadness, and a quiet kind of bravery. "We're not what you think," she said softly. "We're not just refugees." Ethan felt his stomach knot. He already knew this was more than some simple escape story, but nothing could have prepared him for what came next. "We're the last of the Zervian Empire," Lyria said. "The last of our bloodline." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Ethan's heart slammed against his ribs. He felt like the ground had just been ripped out from under him. "The Zervian Empire is dead," he said slowly, his voice dangerous. "Wiped out. Extinct." Sora's voice was barely above a whisper. "Not all of us." The room spun. Ethan felt like he couldn't breathe. Zervians. The name alone brought a flood of memories. Stories of war, destruction, and loss passed down through generations. The Zervian Empire had been the most feared force in the galaxy. Their psychic abilities were devastating, their armies unstoppable. And when they set their sights on Earth a century ago, humanity had barely survived. Ethan's grandfather had fought in that war. He'd told Ethan stories of the invasion, of entire cities turned to ash in seconds, of soldiers driven mad by the Zervian psychic attacks. Billions had died before the Zervians were finally defeated. And now the last of that monstrous race was sitting right in front of him. "Why should I believe you?" Ethan's voice was ice. "Why shouldn't I turn you in right now?" Lyria's eyes filled with tears. "Because if you do, we'll die." "The Krell Dominion's been hunting us," Sora said, his voice shaking. "They want to wipe out our bloodline, make sure the Zervians never rise again." "Maybe that's a good thing," Ethan snapped, the words harsh and bitter. "Do you have any idea what your people did to mine? My grandfather fought in that war. I grew up hearing about the billions who died because of the Zervians." Lyria's tears fell silently, but she didn't look away. "We know," she whispered, "and we're sorry." Ethan stared at her, stunned. "Sorry." The word seemed so small, so meaningless compared to the weight of the blood spilled by their people. "We weren't part of that war," Sora said desperately. "We were born long after it ended. We never wanted any of this. We just want to live." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Ethan's mind raced. He wanted to hate them, to see them as the enemy they came from. But they weren't soldiers. They were just kids, scared, alone, and hunted. But that didn't make them any less dangerous. "You have powers," he said finally. "Abilities no one else in the galaxy has. The kind of power that could destroy entire worlds. How do I know you won't use it against humanity again?" Lyria shook her head fiercely. "We don't want to hurt anyone. We've never hurt anyone before today." "But you can," Ethan pressed. "That's why the Krell are after you, isn't it? They're afraid of what you could become." Sora's voice cracked. "So are we." The admission hit harder than Ethan expected. The fear in the boy's voice wasn't just fear of being hunted. It was fear of themselves, of what they were capable of. "We don't know how to control it," Lyria said softly. "Our powers, they react to fear, to danger. We don't want them. We just want to be safe." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind a storm of anger, confusion, and something dangerously close to sympathy. He wanted to see them as a threat. It would make things so much easier. But when he looked at them, all he saw were two terrified children who had no one else. Kara's voice broke the silence. "Ethan, we have incoming." His blood turned cold. "Krell. Works," she said grimly. "A full Dominion strike team. They found us." The ground trembled with the distant sound of approaching ships. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to run. But there was nowhere left to go. He looked at the twins, their faces pale with fear. They weren't warriors. They were just kids who'd been born with powers they never asked for, powers that had made them the galaxy's most wanted fugitives. And Ethan knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let them die. "Get your things," he ordered, his voice hard and steady. "We're getting out of here." Lyria's eyes widened. "You're..." helping us. Ethan's jaw tightened. Don't make me regret it. The outpost shook as the first bombs fell, and Ethan knew they were out of time. Whatever these twins were, whatever they might become, they were his responsibility now, and he protect them. No matter the cost. The air was thick with tension, and Ethan could feel the weight of his decision pressing down on him like 1,000 tons of steel. The twins sat huddled in the corner of the dimly lit room, their wide, luminous eyes filled with fear. The revelation still echoed in his mind. They were Zervians, the last of their kind, the same species that had brought humanity to the brink of extinction. And now the Krell Dominion was hunting them down, determined to wipe them out completely. He paced the room, his boots scraping against the cold metal floor. His heart pounded, and his mind spun with doubt and anger. Kara's calm, synthetic voice cut through the storm of his thoughts. Ethan, we have incoming signals. A Krell dreadship is descending. They're deploying hunters, lots of them. Ethan froze. His blood ran cold. He knew what that meant. The Krell weren't sending just a small squad this time. They were bringing an army. They know the twins are here, Kara continued. We have maybe 15 minutes before they reach the perimeter. 15 minutes? That was all the time he had to decide. His eyes flicked toward the twins. Lyria clung to Sora, her face pale and streaked with tears. Sora was trembling, his small hands clutching the blanket Ethan had given them. They looked so fragile, so young, and yet Ethan knew what they were capable of. He'd seen it with his own eyes. That terrifying burst of power that had thrown Krell soldiers like ragdolls. Power that could destroy worlds. He had two choices. Turn them over to the Krell and save himself. The Dominion would reward him handsomely. He could walk away from this with enough credits to live comfortably for the rest of his life, and with no more blood on his hands. Or stand and fight. Protect the last survivors of the very race that had once tried to annihilate humanity. The choice should have been simple. He should have handed them over without a second thought. But when he looked at them, when he saw the fear and desperation in their eyes, something inside him wouldn't let him do it. He sighed heavily and reached for his rifle. Kara, he said, his voice low and resolute, activate the outpost's defenses and prep the escape route, just in case. You're sure about this? Kara asked. They're Zervians, Ethan. You know what they? I know, he snapped, but they're just kids. And I'm not letting those Krell bastards slaughter them. The AI didn't argue. Defenses online. Parameter turrets armed. But Ethan, there are too many of them. Then we make sure they bleed for it. Ethan turned to the twins. Stay here. Don't move unless I tell you to. And if I say run, you run. Understand? Lyria nodded, her eyes wide. You're really going to help us? Don't make me regret it, he said gruffly, and without waiting for an answer, he headed for the armory. The outpost shook as the first wave of bombs fell, sending tremors through the walls. Ethan loaded his weapons with practiced efficiency. An assault rifle, a plasma blade, and a handful of grenades. He activated his personal cloaking device, feeling the familiar hum as it wrapped him in near invisibility. Outside, the night was alive with fire and death. Krell dropships descended from the sky like birds of prey, and squads of hunters spread out across the wreckage. The automated turrets opened fire, cutting down the first wave in a storm of laser fire. But the Krell kept coming. They always kept coming. Ethan moved like a shadow through the battlefield. Cloaked and silent, he struck from the darkness, his rifle spitting death, his blade carving through the enemy with brutal efficiency. He fought like a man possessed, driven by fury and fear, and the desperate need to protect the children waiting behind him. He took down a Krell sniper with a single shot to the head. A pair of hunters charged his position, and Ethan met them head-on, his plasma blade flaring to life as he danced between them, cutting them down in a flash of burning light. But for every Krell he killed, 3 more took their place. Ethan, Kara's voice crackled in his earpiece. They're overwhelming the defenses. We need to fall back. He cursed under his breath, eyes scanning the battlefield. The turrets were nearly out of ammo, and the escape route he prepared was already compromised. The Krell were closing in, and then he saw them, a squad of hunters breaking off from the main force, heading straight for the outpost, straight for the twins. No, he whispered, already running. He reached the outpost just as the Krell breached the entrance. The first one barely had time to turn before Ethan shot it in the back of the head. The second lunged at him, and they crashed to the ground in a tangle of limbs, Ethan's blade finding its throat just before the creature could tear his own out. But there were too many. He couldn't fight them all. "Stay behind me," he shouted as the twins scrambled out of their hiding spot. The Krell poured into the room, and Ethan fought like a demon. But even he couldn't hold them off forever. A blow to his side sent him crashing to the ground, his vision swimming with pain. He struggled to rise, but the Krell were already closing in on the twins. And then the air rippled. The temperature dropped, and the room was filled with an eerie humming pressure. Lyria and Sora stood side by side, their eyes glowing with blinding light. The Krell froze, and then they screamed. Without a word, the twins unleashed their power. The Krell were lifted off their feet, slammed against the walls with bone-crushing force. The air vibrated with raw energy, and Ethan could only watch in stunned silence as the twins wiped out the entire squad in seconds. When it was over, the room was silent. The twins stood trembling, their eyes dimming as the last of their power faded. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his body aching. "Remind me never to piss you off," he muttered. Lyria looked at him, her face pale and drawn. "We didn't mean to." "I know," he said quietly, "but we're not done yet. The Krell are still out there." Sora's voice was barely a whisper. "What do we do?" Ethan checked his ammo. He was running low. They all were. But there was no turning back now. "We fight," he said simply. "We fight, and we survive." The twins exchanged a glance, and then nodded. And as the Krell closed in, Ethan knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for theirs. The battle had become a nightmare. The sky burned with the glow of Krell dropships, and the air vibrated with the sound of explosions and the distant, inhuman roars of their hunters. Ethan's hands were slick with sweat and blood as he reloaded his rifle, his breath ragged. He was running out of ammo, out of energy, and out of time. Behind him, the twins stood close, their eyes wide and frightened. He knew they were powerful. He had seen their terrifying abilities firsthand, but they were still just kids. And right now, the Krell were closing in from all sides. Another wave of enemies pushed forward, their cloaking devices flickering as they emerged from the shadows. Ethan fired, his shots precise and deadly. But it wasn't enough. For every Krell that fell, 3 more took its place. The outpost's defenses were crumbling. He could hear the automated turrets sputtering, their ammunition almost spent. Kara's voice crackled in his earpiece. "Ethan, they're breaching the north perimeter. You need to fall back now." "There's nowhere left to fall back to," he growled, cutting down another Krell with a burst of gunfire. "We're running out of time." "We can stop them," a soft voice said behind him. Ethan turned, his heart pounding. It was Sora. The boy's face was pale, his eyes shimmering with a strange light. Lyria stood next to him, her expression just as resolute. "But if we do?" Sora's voice wavered. "You might not recognize us anymore." Ethan stared at them, the weight of their words settling over him like a lead blanket. He didn't know what they meant, but he could see the fear in their eyes, the fear of their own power. "What happens if you use your full strength?" he asked quietly. Lyria hesitated. "We don't know. We've never done it before." The Krell were closing in. The outpost shook with another explosion, and Ethan knew they were out of options. "Do it," he said, his voice rough. "Whatever it takes. Just stop them." The twins nodded, and then they stepped forward. The air shifted. It grew heavy, charged with a strange electric energy that made Ethan's hair stand on end. The ground trembled beneath their feet. The Krell, sensing the change, hesitated at the edge of the battlefield. And then the twins began to glow. It started as a soft golden light that radiated from their skin, but it quickly grew brighter, hotter, until Ethan had to shield his eyes. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to howl. The first Krell charged, and never made it. An invisible force slammed into the creature, lifting it off its feet and hurling it backward with bone-crushing speed. The others followed, their weapons raised, but the twins didn't even flinch. The air exploded. Ethan watched, stunned, as a wave of raw energy tore across the battlefield. Krell soldiers were thrown like ragdolls, their bodies slamming into walls and debris with sickening force. Lightning crackled through the air, and the very ground split beneath them. The twins didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply stood there, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, and the Krell died around them. It was over in minutes. When the dust settled, the battlefield was unrecognizable. The Krell were gone, wiped out completely. Smoke rose from the scorched earth, and the air was thick with the smell of ozone and burned flesh. And then the twins collapsed. Lyria, Sora. Ethan was at their side in an instant, his heart pounding. They lay still, their small bodies pale and trembling. Their breathing was shallow, their faces slack with exhaustion. "Come on," he whispered, his hands shaking as he checked their pulses. "Don't do this. Don't." Kara's voice cut through his panic. "Ethan, I'm detecting more Krell ships inbound. You need to move now." But Ethan couldn't leave them. Guilt crashed over him in waves. He had asked them to use their power, and now they were paying the price. They were just children, forced to become weapons because he hadn't been strong enough to protect them. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. The sound of engines roared overhead. Ethan looked up, his jaw tightening as more Krell dropships descended through the smoke. The battle wasn't over, not yet. But this time, Ethan wouldn't ask the twins to fight. This time, he would protect them. He stood, his rifle heavy in his hands. "Kara, prep the escape route. I'm getting them out of here." "Ethan, do it." He lifted Lyria into his arms, her body limp and cold against his chest. Sora stirred weakly, and Ethan helped him to his feet. The boy's legs barely held him, but there was no time for rest. "Stay with me, kid," Ethan said quietly. "I'm getting you both out of this." But as the Krell ships landed and the next wave of soldiers poured out, Ethan knew the odds were stacked against them. And he didn't care. He would fight until his last breath if it meant keeping them safe. The battle had ended. The battlefield lay in ruins, charred earth and broken bodies scattered around. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the dust and smoke from the fierce clash began to settle. The Krell were defeated, wiped out by the unimaginable power of the twins. But even in victory, a strange unease gnawed at him. The silence that followed the storm of psychic destruction was almost deafening. Ethan stood over the twins, their small bodies lying motionless on the ground. They had sacrificed so much to protect him, and now they were barely clinging to life. Their power had saved them all, but the toll it had taken on their fragile forms was clear. Their glowing eyes had dimmed, and their breathing was shallow. Ethan crouched beside them, his hands trembling as he checked their pulses. "Lyria? Sora?" He whispered urgently, his voice shaking with fear. His fingers pressed against their necks, and after what seemed like an eternity, he felt the faintest thrum of life. "They're alive," he muttered to himself, relief washing over him. But his eyes flicked to the horizon, where Krell ships were still visible, their engines roaring as they descended. Kara's voice broke into his thoughts. "Ethan, more Krell are coming. You don't have much time. The outpost defenses are already compromised." He looked around. The outpost was in ruins. Most of the walls were breached, and the automated turrets lay in pieces. But there was no time to mourn the destruction. The twins needed him, and he wasn't about to let them down. "Help me get them to safety," he said, his voice low and determined. Kara's robotic hum filled the air as she activated the emergency escape route. Ethan lifted Lyria in his arms, her frail body limp against his chest, and Sora stumbled at his side, his steps weak and unsteady. The boy clung to Ethan as if his life depended on it, his fear palpable. The escape route was a narrow, hidden tunnel beneath the outpost, one of the few places Ethan had left untouched by the Krell assault. It led to a secluded cave system that would give them temporary shelter, but it was only a stopgap. He knew the Krell wouldn't give up easily, and soon the Galactic Council would arrive, drawn by the power of the twins. They had to leave this place before that happened. As they made their way through the dark, cramped tunnels, Ethan kept one eye on the rearview display of his suit. The Krell ships were already landing, and soon the search parties would be out looking for them. The escape tunnel's entrance was hidden deep in the wilderness, but it wouldn't stay hidden for long. "We'll make it," Ethan muttered, more to himself than to the twins. But his words were hollow. He didn't believe them. He couldn't. There was no way they would be safe for long. When they finally reached the cave system, Ethan set the twins down gently, their breathing still weak but steadier now. He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair, trying to steady his racing thoughts. "This isn't over," he muttered. "They'll come for you. The Krell, the Galactic Council, they'll never stop." Lyria's eyes fluttered open, her pale face still etched with exhaustion. She glanced up at Ethan, and despite her weakened state, there was something fierce in her gaze. "We know." Sora stirred as well, his eyes flickering open. "We won't make it easy for them," he rasped, his voice hoarse. Ethan frowned, studying them carefully. They were recovering, but something about their eyes seemed different. The innocence that had once been there was gone, replaced by something darker, something older than their years. "Why did you do it?" he asked quietly, his voice a mix of admiration and fear. "Why did you unleash that power?" Laria looked at him, her expression unreadable. "We didn't have a choice. We knew you would protect us, but we couldn't let them destroy you too." Sora nodded, his face set in a grim expression. "We are the last of our kind. The Krell won't stop hunting us. If we don't fight back, there will be nothing left of us." Ethan swallowed hard. He had seen their power firsthand, and it terrified him. What had they become in their desperate need to survive? How much of their true selves had they lost in the process? "You're not just kids anymore, are you?" he whispered, more to himself than to them. "No," Lyria said softly, her voice filled with a quiet sadness. "We never were." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truths. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something inside them had changed, that the darkness he had seen in their eyes was only a glimpse of what was to come. They were the last remnants of a once great empire, an empire that had almost destroyed humanity. And now, the fate of the universe lay in their hands. As the twins rested, Ethan took a seat nearby, his back against the cold stone of the cave. Kara's voice came through his earpiece. "Ethan, I'm detecting multiple ships in orbit. The Galactic Council is on their way." "I know," Ethan muttered, rubbing his eyes. "Get the escape routes ready. We're leaving soon." "You're going to need a plan," Kara said, her voice tinged with concern. "You're not going to be able to outrun them forever." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice tight, "but I won't let them take the twins. Not while I'm still breathing." He stood, walking toward the twins. He knelt beside them, his expression firm. "We're not safe here, but I'm going to protect you. No matter what it takes, I won't let anyone take you." Sora looked up at him, his gaze searching. "Even if it means fighting the whole galaxy." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Even if it means that." The twins exchanged a look, something passing between them that Ethan couldn't understand. Then Lyria spoke. "You don't know what you're asking, Ethan. You don't know what we're capable of." "I don't care," he replied, his voice strong. "I made a promise, and I'm not backing down now." For a moment, there was silence. The weight of their past hung in the air, thick with the knowledge that the galaxy would never let them rest. The Krell had been only the beginning. The Galactic Council would come, and the twins' power would draw the attention of even darker forces. But Ethan had made a choice, and now there was no turning back. "I won't leave you," he said, his voice steady. "I'll protect you, whatever it takes." Lyria and Sora exchanged another look, and this time the flicker of darkness in their eyes seemed to soften. But there was still something deep within them, something untamed, something dangerous. And as Ethan watched them, he couldn't help but wonder, had he just saved humanity's greatest hope or its greatest threat?